again, it's just so nice actually being in a physical space and with everyone. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to talk a little bit about my practice and how I've been working with AI or machine learning for the past, I would say, 5-6 years. As kind of was mentioned earlier, I'm really interested in kind of systems of knowledge and how knowledge is formed and kept. And part of this interest kind of comes about in unpicking new technologies and seeing how they're created and looking at how they kind of reach back into kind of the histories of society and science and what traces, connotations, and associations they bring. So really kind of like understanding how everything works. I use machine learning not just as a tool, so not just as kind of like a button that you press, but as a process. So it informs the entire project. And a large part of this is constructing the science from the ground up. So I do everything from the algorithm through to kind of data collection, through to kind of combining everything, through to kind of creating the installation. And this, I feel, really allows me to understand and show the error states and assumptions and reveal the labor that kind of sits behind using this technology, whilst inverting the usual process of doing such things. I think a lot of conversations around AI and creativity, not today, but kind of center around kind of like whether machines can make art or kind of what kind of like, and those kind of questions around, you know, are they going to replace artists? Whereas kind of, for me, that kind of misses out what is fundamentally interesting, which is kind of the people, the humanness that is inherent in using this process. There's so much human decision-making that sits at the heart of working with machine learning and is essential for kind of creating anything. So I kind of like, so as I said, I use it just as a tool and a process. And I do think kind of as you end up kind of working in these two very different ways when you're creating. Really, when you're working with machine learning, you're working with two main things. You're working with the algorithm, which I'm going to talk about through a series of works, and you're to do with memory, and you're working with the data set, which I'll also discuss. And you have two very, very different mindsets, I think, when you're working with each of these two things, which are almost always in opposition. You kind of have the kind of tension between absolute precision when you're trying to code versus kind of the openness of trying to create an artwork. When you're trying to kind of write an algorithm, you're trying to kind of collapse all possible meanings into one. You really have to be like so unambiguous. Like, it's like talking to a very literal 5-year-old. You have to be like, this is a tangerine, this is not a clementine, this is like a particular like type of apple, this is not. You have to be so precise. And that's a very, very different way, I think, of kind of approaching the world when you're kind of trying to create an artwork where you're trying to be ambiguous, you're trying to embed all of these different meanings. You're trying to kind of create something that can hold multiple stories within it. So I think there's this kind of very weird sensation when you do both of these parts of the practice, when you both kind of create everything, kind of do all of that technical work yourself, and kind of like create the kind of final vision where you're trying to, hold these two things that kind of sit in opposition at the same time, which is just a very kind of like long introduction. If this will play, to kind of for me to start talking about. Yes, kind of like to begin with, kind of talking about the relationship that I have with an algorithm, which is complex. The algorithms that I've most commonly used with my work are GANs. Which are notoriously unstable and brittle. This is something training. This is and I think kind of like there's a tendency maybe to kind of like think about GANs to kind of think about machine learning and anthropomorphize it, to think of it as being kind of like to assign it human qualities. Often when people kind of talk about what comes out of machine learning projects, visions, they're described as kind of dreaming or hallucinating. And I think as tempting as it is to anthropomorphize platformize the process and make links between our own experiences and what comes out of a machine, a GAN or a model doesn't dream, at least not like we dream. And I think there's this big kind of also tension about how we're ascribing intelligence to these things, but we're very much modeling intelligence on human intelligence, whereas kind of, we just heard in the last presentation, there are so many other forms of intelligence. The actual mechanism that's working is far more prosaic. It's repeated applications of the same simple operations that something like a video game engine uses. But linguistically, even by scientists, so sometimes if you go into code, open source code, and look at kind of like the comments that have been left, you can kind of see the working out that scientists have done. And even there, kind of like they call it dreaming and hallucinating. And so even there, this connection has been made of kind of combining kind of like how kind of like these machines are perceived with our own experience. And so you get into what I feel is kind of like maybe an unhelpful state where more and more consciousness is being attributed to a mathematical way of doing things than what is really happening. Consciousness is very, very, very hard to achieve, at least by kind of like what we think of as human consciousness. And so this is basically ancient in terms of deep learning projects that I did. It's about 5-6 years old, where I've been working kind of quite heavily with kind of ideas around kind of early cinema and thinking about parallels between kind of like early cinema with machine learning. There are kind of like lots of similarities between kind of like their technologies in their infancies. Both are trying to record and reflect the world. Both are kind of like done by people who are kind of like in control, exposing, and you can kind of like look through stuff around implicit bias and more critical views. But one of the things that I kind of like started to kind of work with and find interesting was kind of creating my own data sets to make these. So I drew lots and lots of stills from a film and kind of trained it. And this piece is The Fall of the House of Usher, which kind of explores concepts to do with repetition, remembrance, and recreation that are central to the original story by Edgar Allan Poe. And one of the kind of reasons why I started to use machine learning was because you could start to control how this kind of like collapse and disintegration happens by controlling the amount of information that goes into the data set and that the algorithm learns from. And it's something that I could have totally hand animated if I wanted to, but by using machine learning and by kind of like thinking about the kind of like reciprocity between the machine and the creator, I was able to kind of like highlight some of the aspects around memory that I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. And I found also there's all sorts of things around drawing things and then looking at how the machine then recreates it, that you kind of get this weird kind of understanding of kind of like how you draw, how you're kind of like recording the world that you don't, that kind of like, it's like, I always describe it as kind of like catching a glimpse of yourself in the mirror before you realize it's you. You kind of like, it's this very uncanny process. So that's kind of like a couple of years old. This is another project that I did more recently that I wanted to include. This is a series of experiments that I did where I called Let Me Dream Again. And I wanted to include it because I don't actually feel that these were particularly successful experiments. And I think it's important to acknowledge when you're working with these technologies, when you're working with things that are at the edge of kind of what is possible, a lot of the time things fail. So I spent a year trying to train on video clips and it just did not work. And I spent a year trying to kind of like use all of this like new stuff that was coming out in like 2018 through 2019. And what I was trying to do didn't work. These technologies are so brittle and so fragile. And a lot of the time kind of like they're trained to do one very, very specific thing. And there'll be headlines about it and you think, oh, this is amazing. I can do all of these like great things. And then as soon as you try to kind of like actually get into it and actually like maybe try and do something even slightly different, it will collapse. Or you'll need, the other thing that I think with a lot of this new technology that's coming out, you need a lot of GPUs, you need a lot of compute time, and it becomes very expensive unless you're partnered with a university or other institutions. The other thing that I find quite hard about working with GANs in this way is that they don't understand space and time in the way that we understand space and time. So you kind of like get this kind of weird kind of like things going on. So one of the things that I did was that I then pulled stills from the training set and it started to embed them in the film to try and kind of create this structure and create this narrative. Blending the past and the present, the real and the dreamlike, recutting and reconfiguring to kind of like join things that shouldn't be joined. So kind of like the previous work that I showed was more about disintegration, a disintegration loop, destroying until there was no meaning left. This I kind of did the opposite, where I was trying to kind of like remake something that had disappeared until it kind of like started to have meaning. As I mentioned, a core part of my work is creating data sets. So for those of you who don't know, data sets are kind of like the information that is fed to the algorithm, and they're often hundreds and hundreds, thousands and thousands, millions and millions of inputs. So for a project that I'm going to talk about now, which is a project that I'm probably best known about around tulips, I created my own data set and processed it myself, labeled it myself, categorized it myself. I think later this afternoon there's going to be a lot of talk around the bias around creating data sets. And there is this huge thing, like where does this information come from? Who is giving access to the data, and how is that kind of being held? All of those kind of questions are really important to ask and very important for me as an artist. So I try to create my own data sets from scratch. So I took 10,000 photographs of tulips in the Netherlands over the course of 3 months. And the reason why I stopped at 10,000 wasn't because like it's a nice round number, although it is. It's because tulip season ended. So even though I ended up making a very digital piece, it was driven by the rhythms of nature. And you have this very different relationship to your data set if you do that work yourself. It's very different from kind of just like pulling down 10,000 images off Google to taking those photographs yourself. It's a very physical process, and you kind of you start to have this kind of like understanding of what's there, and really kind of like can kind of like, it becomes like craft, this like repetitive, time-consuming but necessary thing to produce something beautiful. And you also really start to understand kind of like some of the outputs of the model, which maybe you can talk about in discussion. Because of the time and effort and energy that I kind of went into making this data set, because it was months and it was a huge amount of money to buy all of those tulips, I wanted to make it into a separate artwork, so not just something that existed as like a TF record or as like a list of images on my laptop. I wanted to make it into an artwork to kind of like give it that status that it didn't have at the time, because this was again in 2018 when people weren't talking about data sets as much as they are now. I think when you make information physical, there's something quite powerful about that. It's really easy to forget in a digital age that information does kind of like exist in the real world, and that stuff that you see rendered on your screen at some point, you know, somewhere in a chain of kind of like different algorithms or different kind of processes or different programs, there will have been a real object in the real world that it was modeled on, or a photograph was taken, or something. And once you kind of place things back in the real world, people can start to comprehend aspects about that data that they might not have been able to do before. And you can start to have discussions, particularly in non-technical communities, about how, I think that's another, yeah, back on. Yeah, so you can start to have conversations, particularly in non-technical communities, about how this kind of like, how this came about, and how there's always a human decision somewhere along the line of the chain of using AI. So I hand wrote some of the labels that I was then using in this project on this data set, And you can kind of see, I think, in some of them, like where I've kind of like changed my mind and crossed out that label, or haven't put, I think there's one where the label isn't there, which kind of like, how even if you're trying so hard and trying to make something, spending months of your time doing it, there are still error states in it. And also how this human decision making kind of, even for something as simple as a single type of flower, like a tulip, it's actually very difficult to kind of like put this into kind of like binary categories, like, is something red or is it orange? Is it white or is it actually pale pink? And you start to kind of really kind of like see the difficulty of doing this at scale. And I think colour is actually a very nice example of this. The communication of colour is very, very difficult, and it's something that even kind of like Carl Linnaeus, who is interesting in many ways and also problematic in a lot of ways, he refused to have colour as part of his original taxonomies of plants because it was so difficult to kind of like have any kind of standardization around it. So I used this data set then that I spent all this time making to create a piece called Mosaic Virus. This is an install shot, and then this is like a little video of it playing. This was a piece, so each of the stills is kind of generated using a GAN, and you can kind of, this was done in 2019, and you can already see the difference between that first video that I showed you in, I think, like 2016, 2017, and now, and how the quality of kind of what you're able to produce has just improved so dramatically. I think this is something else that is kind of really happening, that the kind of like the ability to kind of like create hyper-realistic looking things is there now, and so. And the kind of traces of kind of process are harder to find. And I think that for me kind of like also raises a lot of questions, because it's the traces of process, the artifacts, the things that are failing, that really draw attention to the fact that something has been made with AI. And once they're gone, once they become too smooth, you stop noticing it. And when you stop noticing it, you stop questioning it and kind of like asking whether, like this is, like what, is this right? Should we be working in this way? But anyway, this piece, I'll put it on installation view again, draws historical parallels between the tulip mania that swept across the Netherlands in the 1630s, where kind of like allegedly a price of a tulip bulb went for the same price as an Amsterdam townhouse, to the ongoing speculation around cryptocurrencies, and also the speculation that is going on around AI. We're kind of like living in the middle of an AI hype cycle. And in the piece, see if it will play again. In the piece, the kind of like shape of the tulips and the appearance of the tulips are controlled by the price of Bitcoin. So as they kind of, and that's why I had to like label everything. So it kind of like, it becomes this updated version of the Dutch still life. The Mosaic Virus is the name of the virus that causes stripes in the tulips. They were some of the most valuable tulips at the height of tulip mania. And so in the piece, as the tulips become more stripy, more open, that's the price of Bitcoin going up. So it's another way of reading financial markets. But what I kind of liked about kind of working on this particular project and this aspect of the project was that I was able to bring in kind of like these ideas around speculation in ways that I wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So because of the fact that AI is in this hype cycle, and then also because of like ideas, like the process of working with it, like you have something called mode collapse, where kind of like when you train a GAN, you kind of like looks like the learning rate looks like it's getting better and better and better, and then will suddenly collapse, which is kind of also how the markets behave in speculative bubbles. So you kind of get this kind of mirroring. Furthermore, you kind of like have these kind of like I was talking a little bit before about like bringing out the histories of stuff that kind of like sit in computer science. There's something called the iris flower dataset, which comes with package learn. So every time kind of like someone uses that in a machine learning model, they also have this iris flower data set that kind of sits in there as well. There's all these kind of like nice connections that I think kind of like came out for me when I was making this project. And so just to kind of like end with very quickly how I kind of see working with machine learning as part of my practice. I don't see kind of like it sitting in the line of kind of like algorithmic art for me. I think of it much more in the context of like land or environmental art, where you're kind of spending a huge amount of time setting up all of the variables, a huge amount of time planning, a huge amount of time like constructing kind of like what might happen, and then allowing something else that you can't control to work on it in a way that you can predict but can never actually know what the outcome will be until it has happened.
Okay, thanks a lot.